It started as a routine summer vacation, but it ended as the longest goodbye in royal history. In July 1914, Grand Duchess Maria Georgievna boarded a train to England, waving a casual farewell to her husband on a platform in St. Petersburg. She thought she would be back before the first snow. Instead, she had just looked into the eyes of the love of her life for the very last time. While Maria was trapped in the manicured safety of an English spa town by the outbreak of World War I, her husband was left behind to face the apocalypse of the Russian Revolution alone. Helpless and isolated, she spent years fighting a losing battle to save him, only to learn that he had been executed by a Bolshevik firing squad while clutching her picture. This is the harrowing story of the Romanov who survived, and the excruciating guilt of being the one left standing. Maria was born into the glittering clan of European royalty on March 3, 1876, in Athens. But she was not born a Grand Duchess. She was born Princess Maria of Greece and Denmark, the daughter of King George I of Greece and Grand Duchess Olga Konstantinovna of Russia. If you imagine a Victorian princess as a stiff corseted creature fainting on a chaise lounge, you have the wrong picture of Maria. In the family, she was known as Greek Minnie, to distinguish her from her formidable aunt, the Empress Maria Feodorovna of Russia. And Greek Minnie was a force of nature. She grew up in the chaotic, democratic atmosphere of Athens, running wild in the gardens of the Tatoi Palace. She hated shoes. She hated protocol. She loved climbing trees and shouting matches. She was vibrant, loud, opinionated, and fiercely patriotic about her adopted Greek homeland. Her father, King George, was a Dane who had been elected to the Greek throne, and he ran his family with a mixture of Scandinavian informality and Mediterranean passion. Maria grew up speaking English with a slight accent, French, German, and Greek. She was a true cosmopolitan, a citizen of a Europe that had no borders for people of her rank. She was the kind of girl who would slide down banisters in her ball gowns and argue politics with prime ministers. But in the late 19th century, a princess, no matter how wild, had a singular purpose: to be a pawn in the great game of dynastic alliances. And the biggest board in the game was Russia. The Romanovs were the titans of the age. They were richer, more powerful, and more autocratic than any other family on earth. To marry a Romanov was to win the lottery. But Maria wanted nothing to do with them. She had visited Russia as a child and hated it. She found the court of St. Petersburg stifling, filled with gossips, spies, and endless religious rituals that bored her to tears. The weather was gray, the people were servile, and the etiquette was a straitjacket. "I would rather be a street sweeper in Athens than a Grand Duchess in Russia," she reportedly said. But fate, in the form of a persistent limping man, had other plans. Grand Duke George Mikhailovich was the polar opposite of the fiery Greek princess. Known as Gigi, he was the third son of Grand Duke Michael Nikolaevich. While other Grand Dukes were famous for their drinking, their mistresses, and their reckless behavior, Gigi was a quiet scholar. A childhood injury had left him with a bad leg, which kept him out of the more vigorous military parades that the Romanov men lived for. Instead of soldiers, he commanded coins. He was a numismatist of world renown, building one of the finest collections of Russian currency in existence. He was gentle, deeply religious, artistic, and painfully shy. He saw Maria during her visits to Russia and fell quietly, hopelessly in love. He saw the life in her, the fire that he lacked. He courted her for years, and for years Maria said no. She rejected him flat out. She didn't want to live in Russia. She didn't want to leave the sun. She didn't want to marry a man who was so quiet. But in the royal world, no is often just the beginning of a negotiation. The pressure began to mount. Her father, the king, urged her to consider the match. It was a good alliance. George was wealthy and kind. He wasn't a brute like some of his cousins. Finally, worn down by duty and perhaps touched by George's dogged devotion, Maria relented. "I will marry him," she told her family, "but I will never be a Russian." They were married in 1900 on the island of Corfu, a location that was a concession to the bride's love for Greece. It was a dazzling affair, but even on her wedding day, Maria was looking back at what she was losing. She was trading her freedom for a title. She moved to St. Petersburg and entered the gilded cage. The early years of their marriage were a study in contrasts. Maria, true to her word, never quite assimilated. She found the Russian aristocracy to be shallow and Asiatic. She refused to play the court games. She spoke her mind, often shocking the conservative dowagers of St. Petersburg with her slang and her opinions. She famously disliked the Empress Alexandra, finding her neurotic and cold, a sentiment that put her at odds with the inner circle of the Tsar. George, for his part, adored her. He let her redecorate their palaces. He indulged her whims. He was the calm harbor to her storm. And slowly a strange thing happened. The arranged marriage turned into a genuine partnership. It wasn't a passionate romance of poetry and fire, but it was a deep, abiding friendship. Maria came to respect George's kindness, his integrity, and his infinite patience. They had 2 daughters, Princess Nina and Princess Xenia. The happiest moments of their Russian life were spent away from the capital. George bought land in the Crimea on a promontory overlooking the Black Sea and built an estate called Harrowing. Here, the climate was warm, reminiscent of Maria's beloved Greece. Here, they could escape the prying eyes of the court. At Harrowing, they were a normal family. George would sit in his study cataloging his coins. Maria would garden, swim, and play with the girls. Photos from this time show a relaxed, smiling family. Maria in white linen dresses, the girls with big ribbons in their hair, George leaning on his cane, looking at them with fierce pride. They were building a private world, oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath the Romanov dynasty was already beginning to liquefy. But the idol of the Crimea was not enough to protect the children. By 1914, both Nina and Xenia were sickly. The damp, freezing winters of St. Petersburg were destroying their health. The doctors were concerned. They recommended a change of air. In the Edwardian era, there was one cure for everything: the mineral waters of Harrogate, a spa town in Yorkshire, England. It was decided. Maria would take the girls to England for the summer. They would take the cure, enjoy the English countryside, and perhaps visit Maria's British relatives. George would stay behind. His duties as a Grand Duke and director of the Alexander III Museum required his presence in the capital. He promised to join them in the autumn, perhaps in time for Christmas. The planning was routine. Trunks were packed with summer dresses, bathing costumes, and enough jewelry to attend a few balls in London. They didn't pack winter coats. They didn't pack the family silver. Why would they? They were coming back. The departure in July 1914 was just another mark on the social calendar. The farewell at the Warsaw Station was filled with the mundane instructions of domestic life. Don't forget to water the plants. Make sure the staff cleans the drapes. As the train chugged west, crossing the border into Germany, the mood in Europe was tense, but war still seemed like a distant rumble, a diplomatic game that the politicians would surely sort out. Maria and her daughters arrived in London, then traveled north to Harrogate. They settled into a rented house. They began the regimen of drinking the sulphurous waters and walking on the Stray. Then, on June 28, 1914, In a city called Sarajevo, an archduke was shot. The dominoes began to fall. Austria declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized to help Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia. On August 4th, 1914, Great Britain declared war on Germany. Maria woke up in Harrogate to find that the world had changed overnight. The borders were sealed. The North Sea was mined. The train lines across Europe were seized for troop movements. She went to the telegraph office to send a message to George. The lines were jammed. Confusion reigned. At first, the feeling was one of annoyance rather than terror. "We shall be stuck here for a few weeks," people said. "It will be over by Christmas." Maria was a Grand Duchess. She was used to borders opening for her. She was used to trains waiting for her. The idea that she could be trapped was absurd. She fully expected a diplomatic courier to arrive with special papers, or a British warship to be dispatched to take her home. But the courier never came. The warship never arrived. In St. Petersburg, Grand Duke George watched the patriotic crowds cheering in Palace Square. He saw the Tsar holding up the icon of Christ. He felt the surge of Russian nationalism, but his heart sank. He knew, with the instinct of a historian, that war was a gamble the Romanovs could not afford to take. And he knew, with a sudden sick feeling in his stomach, that his wife and daughters were on the other side of a wall of fire. He went back to his empty palace. He walked into the nursery where the girls' dolls were still sitting on the shelves. He sat at his desk and dipped his pen in ink. "My precious Minnie," he wrote, "it seems we are to be parted for a little while." He did not know that a little while meant forever. The trap had snapped shut. The vacation was over. The exile had begun. As the leaves turned in England and the first snows fell in Russia, the terrifying reality of their separation began to set in. What was supposed to be a brief interlude transformed into a silent, agonizing siege of the heart, fought not with guns, but with letters that took weeks to cross a burning continent. The first Christmas of the Great War, 1914, was a season of delusional hope. In Harrogate, the English spa town where Maria and her daughters were stranded, the shop windows were frosted with artificial snow, and the newspapers were full of optimistic reports about our boys being home by spring. Maria bought presents for Nina and Zinnia, dolls, books, new ribbons, and placed them under a tree that felt alien and small compared to the towering firs of the Winter Palace. She set a place at the table for George, an empty chair that served as a silent promise. He will be here soon. This is just a delay. But as the calendar turned to 1915 and then 1916, the illusion of a short war evaporated in the poisonous yellow gas of the Western Front. The delay stretched into a permanent state of being. The vacation mutated into an exile. For Maria, life in England became a surreal purgatory. She was a Grand Duchess of Russia, a cousin of King George V, and a member of the most exclusive club on earth. She was not starving. She was not in a trench. She lived in comfortable rented houses, first in Harrogate and later in London. She took tea with the British aristocracy. She attended charity bazaars. To the outside world, she was the picture of privileged safety, but internally, she was screaming. Her existence was defined by the arrival of the postman. The only thread connecting her to the man she loved was a fragile lifeline of paper and ink that had to travel across a continent on fire. Letters from Russia took weeks, sometimes months, to arrive. They were routed through neutral Sweden or Norway, often opened by censors, stained with damp and wrinkled from being carried in diplomatic pouches. George's letters from this period are a masterclass in protective love. He knew the truth of what was happening in Russia, the hunger, the incompetence of the government, the rivers of blood flowing at the front. But he shielded Maria from the horror. He wrote to her about the weather. He wrote about the garden at Harrowing. He wrote about the girls' nursery in St. Petersburg, which he kept exactly as they had left it, visiting it every night to say good night to their empty beds. "My thoughts never leave you," he wrote in 1915. "I sit here in the evenings and imagine you are in the next room. The silence of the house is heavy, but knowing you are safe is my only comfort." While Maria was safe in the manicured gardens of England, George was witnessing the slow-motion suicide of the Romanov dynasty. Because of his bad leg, George could not lead a cavalry charge like his dashing cousins. Instead, the Tsar appointed him as a special commissioner to inspect the hospitals and the supply lines. It was an unglamorous job, but it gave George a front-row seat to the catastrophe. He traveled the vast length of the Eastern Front in his private train. He saw soldiers fighting without boots. He saw rifles that had no ammunition. He saw the gangrene and the typhus. George was a loyal Romanov, but he was not blind. He saw that the government in St. Petersburg was rotten. The Tsar, Nicholas II, was a good man, but a terrible autocrat, indecisive, weak, and totally dominated by his wife, Empress Alexandra. And behind the Empress stood the dark, bearded figure of Grigory Rasputin. George hated Rasputin. He saw the holy man for what he was, a cancer eating away at the credibility of the throne. George was part of the faction of Grand Dukes who tried desperately to warn the Tsar. He wrote letters to Nicholas, pleading with him to dismiss Rasputin, to appoint competent ministers, to listen to the people. "We are sitting on a powder keg," George warned. "If we do not change, everything will be blown sky high." But Nicholas, isolated at the front headquarters, refused to listen. He saw any criticism as betrayal. He stopped inviting George to meetings. He froze him out. So George retreated into his work and his loneliness. He spent his nights in the vast, echoing marble halls of the new Michael Palace in St. Petersburg. He would sit in his study surrounded by his thousands of rare coins, ancient Greek drachmas, Roman denarii, kopecks from the time of Peter the Great. He found comfort in the coins. They were cold, hard, and orderly history. They made sense in a way the world outside did not. Back in England, Maria felt the ground shifting. She read the British newspapers, which were becoming increasingly critical of Russia. She heard the whispers in London society. The Tsar is incompetent. The Empress is a German spy. Revolution is coming. She tried to use her influence. She visited her cousin, King George V, at Buckingham Palace. They looked remarkably alike. The Windsors and the Romanovs shared the same hooded eyes and beards. The king was sympathetic, but he was distant. He was a constitutional monarch, terrified of his own precarious position. He couldn't just snap his fingers and fix Russia. He gave Maria tea and sympathy, but he gave her no solutions. Then came the winter of 1916, the winter of hunger. In St. Petersburg, the bread lines stretched for miles. The temperature dropped to 30 below zero. The people were freezing and starving, while the aristocracy danced at the last frantic balls of the empire. In December 1916, Rasputin was murdered by Prince Yusupov and Grand Duke Dmitri. It was a desperate attempt to save the monarchy, but it was too late. The murder didn't stop the rot. It just signaled the beginning of the chaos. In February 1917, the dam broke. It started with women banging on pots and pans demanding bread. It ended days later with the complete collapse of 300 years of Romanov rule. The soldiers mutinied. The police fled. The Tsar stopped on his train in the middle of a snowy siding in Pskov, signed the instrument of abdication. Maria was in London when the news broke. The headline screamed, "Tsar abdicates, revolution in Russia." Her first thought was not for the crown, but for George. Where was he? Was he safe? For weeks there was silence. The telegraph lines were cut. The postal service collapsed. Maria lived in a state of suspended animation, pacing the floor of her London house, terrified that every knock on the door would bring news of his death. Finally, word came through. George was alive. When the revolution broke out, George had been in St. Petersburg. He had watched the red flags go up over the Winter Palace. He had seen the double-headed eagles torn down from the gates. But unlike some of his cousins who fled immediately to the south or to Finland, George stayed. Perhaps he was too paralyzed by the speed of events. Perhaps he believed naively that, as a man who had never hurt anyone, he would be left alone. He formally resigned his commission in the army. He accepted the new provisional government. He asked only for permission to leave the country to join his wife and children in England. It seemed for a brief, tantalizing moment that it might happen. The provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, was moderate. They didn't want a bloodbath. They granted George permission to leave. He packed his trunks. He prepared his coin collection. He applied for a British visa. And here lies the most bitter pill of Maria's life. The British government, the government of her cousin the king, did not rush to issue the visa. There were delays. There was bureaucracy. The British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, was wary of letting Romanovs into England. He feared it would anger the British working class who sympathized with the revolution. While the diplomats dithered and the paperwork shuffled between London and Petrograd, the window of opportunity slammed shut. The mood in Russia darkened. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, were gaining power. The moderate government was losing control. The slogan, "Peace, Land, and Bread," was replaced by "Death to the Bourgeoisie." In the summer of 1917, the provisional government, fearing for the safety of the Grand Dukes, revoked the permission to leave. Instead, they ordered the Romanovs into internal exile. George was arrested. He was not thrown into a dungeon yet. He was sent to Finland and later brought back to Petrograd. The tone of his letters changed. The hope was gone. "We are in God's hands," he wrote to Maria. "Do not worry about me. I have my faith. I only regret that I cannot see our daughters growing up. Tell them their papa thinks of them every hour." In November 1917, the Second Revolution happened. The Bolsheviks seized power. The world turned red. Now George was no longer a Grand Duke or even a political exile. He was a class enemy. The Bolsheviks hated the Romanovs with a visceral ideological fury. To them, George wasn't a gentle numismatist. He was a symbol of centuries of oppression. In March 1918, the Bolshevik secret police, the Cheka, issued a decree. All members of the Romanov family in Petrograd were to register. George, his brother Nicholas, and his cousin Dmitri dutifully went to the Cheka headquarters at 2 Gorokovaya Street. They were arrested on the spot. They were not charged with any crime. Their crime was their last name. They were exiled to Vologda, a provincial town hundreds of miles north of Moscow. For a few months, life in Vologda was surprisingly tolerable. They lived in a rented house. They could walk in the garden. They were guarded but not mistreated. George spent his time reading and writing to Maria. He tried to be optimistic. He learned how to mend his own clothes. He grew a beard. But in July 1918, the trap tightened. In Ekaterinburg, the Tsar, the Empress, and their 5 children were brutally murdered in the cellar of the Ipatiev house. The Bolsheviks realized there was no going back. The slaughter had begun. Back in Vologda, George was rearrested. This time, there was no pretense of exile. He was thrown into a prison cell. Then he was transported back to Petrograd. He was taken to the Spalernaya prison. It is hard to imagine the shock of Spalernaya for a man raised in the Winter Palace. The cells were damp, rat-infested and overcrowded. George, who had walked on marble floors his whole life, was now sleeping on a plank of wood covered with lice. The food was a watery soup made of rotting fish heads. But the most painful thing was the proximity. The prison was just a few miles from his own palace. He could almost smell the river Neva, the river he had walked beside with Maria. He was home, but he was in hell. In London, Maria was frantic. She was no longer just waiting for letters. She was fighting a one-woman war against the British Foreign Office. She nagged the king. She pestered the ambassadors. She tried to raise money to bribe Bolshevik officials. She heard rumors, terrible rumors, about the Tsar's death, but nobody knew for sure who was alive and who was dead. She clung to the hope that because George was not the Tsar, because he had never been political, because he was just a harmless scholar, he would be spared. "They cannot kill him," she told her friends. "He has done nothing." She did not understand the nature of the beast she was dealing with. The Bolsheviks didn't care about guilt or innocence. They cared about liquidation. Inside Spalernaya prison, George's health began to fail. His bad leg caused him constant agony in the damp cell. He lost weight until he was skeletal, but his spirit remained unbroken. Survivors who shared his cell later recounted his profound kindness. He shared his meager food parcels with younger prisoners. He comforted those who were weeping. He spent hours in prayer. He managed to smuggle a few last letters out to Maria. They were written on scraps of paper, hidden in the laundry that his faithful valet was allowed to collect. "My beloved Minnie," one of the last letters read, "it is getting very dark here. I do not know what tomorrow brings. But I want you to know that my love for you has been the light of my life. If we meet again, it will be a miracle. If not, we will meet in a better world." Maria read these letters in her London drawing room, her hands shaking so hard she could barely hold the paper. She looked at her daughters, Nina and Zania, now teenagers, and saw George's eyes looking back at her. She had to be strong for them. She had to believe in the miracle. But in January 1919, the miracle ran out of time. In Berlin, the German communist leaders Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were murdered by right-wing paramilitaries. The news reached Moscow and Petrograd, sending the Bolshevik leadership into a fury. They wanted revenge. They wanted blood for blood. "We must teach the bourgeoisie a lesson." The order came down. "Execute the hostages." Grand Duke George Mikhailovich was on the list. On the night of January 28, 1919, the heavy iron key turned in the lock of George's cell. He was asleep. The guards shouted at him to get up. "Pack your things." They said, "You are being moved." George knew what that meant. In the Soviet lexicon, being moved at midnight usually meant only one destination. He put on his coat. He took his small icon of the Virgin Mary. He woke his brother Nicholas, who was in the cell next door. They embraced. George limped out into the corridor, leaning heavily on his brother's arm because his leg was too weak to support him. They were led out of the prison and loaded onto a truck. The engine roared, breaking the silence of the frozen Petrograd night. The truck drove through the empty streets, past the palaces that stood dark and looted, past the statues of their ancestors covered in snow. The truck crossed the bridge over the Neva River and turned toward the Peter and Paul Fortress. The fortress. It was the birthplace of St. Petersburg. It was the place where every Tsar, since Peter the Great, was buried in the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul. It was the heart of the dynasty. George must have looked up at the gold spire of the cathedral as the truck rumbled through the gates. He was coming home to the family burial ground, but he would not be given a marble tomb. The truck stopped near the Trubetskoy Bastion. The prisoners, George, his brother Nicholas, and their cousins Paul and Dmitri were ordered out. It was bitterly cold. Their breath hung in the air like smoke. They were marched to a ditch that had been dug near the fortress walls. The firing squad was waiting. They were a ragtag group of soldiers and sailors, smoking cigarettes, looking at the men who had once been gods on earth. George couldn't stand. His leg gave way. He sat in the snow. His brother Nicholas stood over him, protecting him until the end. There were no last words recorded, only prayers. George held his icon. He closed his eyes. He didn't see the rifles raised. He didn't see the flash. He probably saw the sun on the water at Harrowing. He probably saw Maria waving from the train window. The shots rang out, echoing off the stone walls of the fortress. Grand Duke George Mikhailovich fell back into the snow, dead instantly. The vacation was over. The long wait was finished. But in London, the sun came up the next morning, and Maria Georgievna poured herself a cup of tea, checked the post, and waited for a letter that would never come. Maria was living in a state of suspended animation. She checked the post 3 times a day. She scanned the newspapers with the obsessive intensity of a forensic scientist, looking for names in the small print of the reports coming out of Bolshevik Russia. Every time the telephone rang, her heart stopped. While the bullets echoed in the fortress courtyard in London, Maria knew nothing. She simply waited. The chaos of the Russian Civil War had severed all normal lines of communication. The Bolsheviks did not send telegrams to the next of kin. They simply buried the bodies and moved on. Rumors swirled through the Russian émigré community in London like dead leaves. They have escaped to Finland, one rumor said. They are being held for ransom, said another. They were seen on a train to Siberia. Maria clung to these rumors with a desperate, white-knuckled hope. She told her daughters, Nina and Zania, that their father was resourceful, that God was watching over him, that the British government would surely intervene. She visited her cousin, King George V, at Buckingham Palace. The king, with his sad, heavy-lidded eyes, would take her hand and murmur words of comfort. But he offered no facts. He knew that his government had failed to save the Tsar. He likely suspected the fate of the Grand Dukes, but he couldn't or wouldn't confirm it as without proof. It wasn't until months later, as the snow melted in Russia and the first refugees began to trickle out with confirmed stories, that the truth finally arrived. The moment Maria found out is not recorded in a dramatic diary entry, but the reaction of her life tells the story. When the confirmation came that George had been shot by a firing squad in the Peter and Paul fortress, that he had died holding his icon, that he was buried in a mass grave, Maria's world fractured. The guilt was a physical blow. The vacation in 1914 was now a life sentence. She had saved herself and her daughters, yes, but at the cost of abandoning her husband. Every cup of tea she had drunk in the safety of England, every night she had slept in a warm bed, now felt like a betrayal. She tormented herself with what-ifs. What if I hadn't listened to the doctors? What if we had gone back in 1915? What if I had bribed the right official? But Maria Georgievna was not a woman who fainted. She was the daughter of the King of Greece. She was Greek Minnie, fierce, pragmatic, and stubborn. She looked at her 2 teenage daughters, who were now fatherless refugees in a foreign land, and she realized she did not have the luxury of collapsing. She dried her eyes, put on her black mourning crepe, and assessed her situation with the cold eye of a general surveying a battlefield. The battlefield was her bank account. The Romanovs had been the richest family in history. Grand Duke George had possessed a fortune that was difficult to comprehend: palaces, estates, art, and his priceless coin collection. But all of it was gone. The Bolsheviks had seized the palaces. The estates were nationalized. The coin collection was packed into crates and eventually scattered into the Soviet museums or sold abroad. Maria was left with nothing but the contents of the trunks she had packed for a summer holiday in 1914. Fortunately, those trunks contained jewelry. In the hierarchy of royal refugees, jewelry was the only currency that mattered. It was portable wealth. Maria had brought her summer jewels, not the heavy state tiaras, but enough diamonds, pearls, and emeralds to keep a family alive for years if managed correctly. And so began the humiliation of the sale. Maria, a woman who had never handled money in her life, who had servants to pay for everything, had to learn the art of the deal. She went to the jewelers of Bond Street in Paris. She sat in plush offices, unwrapping velvet pouches, watching as men with loops assessed the stones that George had given her as anniversary presents. "This emerald is of fine quality, Your Imperial Highness," they would say, "but the market is flooded. So many Russians are selling." She took what she could get. She sold the pearls to pay for the girl's schooling. She sold the diamonds to pay the rent. She swallowed her pride every single time. She was determined that Nina and Zania would not live in poverty. They would live like princesses, even if their mother had to haggle like a merchant to make it happen. For the next 3 years, Maria lived the life of the grieving widow. She wore black. She attended memorial services. She devoted herself to the Russian Orthodox Church in London. She was the picture of tragic dignity. But there was a fire in Maria that grief couldn't extinguish. She was only 43 years old when George died. She was healthy, vibrant, and possessed a restless energy that chafed against the role of the dowager martyr. She had loved George deeply, but their love had been a quiet, gentle thing. It had been a marriage of friendship and respect. Deep down, a part of her was still the wild Greek princess who climbed trees and hated shoes. She wanted to live. She wanted to feel the sun again. The gray skies of London and the constant weeping of the émigré community began to suffocate her. In 1920, seeking a reprieve from the gloom, she traveled to Rome. And then, inevitably, she went home to Athens. Returning to Greece must have felt like breathing oxygen after years of holding her breath. The light, the sea, the chaotic noise of her family, it brought her back to life. Her father, King George I, had been assassinated in 1913, but her brother Constantine was king. She was surrounded by people who loved her not as the tragic Romanov widow, but as Minnie. And it was in this atmosphere of reawakening in 1922 that she met the man who would define her second act. His name was Pericles Ioannidis. He was not a Grand Duke. He was not a prince. He was not even a count. He was a Greek admiral. Pericles was everything George Mikhailovich had not been. George was limping, shy, scholarly, and saintly. Pericles was rugged, loud, dashing, and dangerous. He was a man of the sea, a man of action. He had dark eyes, a swimmer's build, and a reputation that would have made a Victorian governess faint. He was a gambler. He was a man who lived on the edge. He was charming, volatile, and utterly inappropriate for a Grand Duchess of Russia. And Maria fell for him like a stone. The attraction was visceral. After years of living in the shadow of death, of nursing sick children, of worrying about money, of being the good wife to a saintly martyr, Maria craved life. Pericles offered her passion. He offered her a break from the suffocating etiquette of her past. He didn't treat her like a porcelain doll. He treated her like a woman. But the romance was a scandal. In the 1920s, royal widows, especially Romanov widows, were expected to spend the rest of their lives lighting candles and wearing black. Marrying a commoner? It was unheard of. It was a morganatic marriage, a step down. that would strip her of her status in the eyes of the purists. Her family was horrified. King George V in England was appalled. "A Greek sailor?" the whispers went. "Has Minnie lost her mind?" Her daughters, Nina and Zania, now young women, were confused. They worshipped the memory of their father. Who was this loud man taking his place? Maria didn't care. She had seen her husband executed by a firing squad. She had seen her world destroyed. She realized with a clarity that only trauma can provide that life is too short to worry about what the neighbors think, even if the neighbors are kings. "I have done my duty," she essentially told her critics. "Now I will do what I want." On December 16, 1922, in Wiesbaden, Germany, Grand Duchess Maria Georgievna of Russia married Admiral Pericles Ioannidis. She was 46. He was 41. The marriage marked the end of her life as a purely tragic figure. She was no longer just the widow of the executed Grand Duke. She was a woman charting her own course. But if she thought she was sailing into calm waters, she was mistaken. Pericles was exciting, yes, but he was also a disaster with money. While George had been a meticulous collector of coins, Pericles was a meticulous loser of them. The second half of Maria's life became a strange, nomadic existence. They moved between London, Rome, and Athens. They stayed in grand hotels, but often they had to check out quietly because the bill hadn't been paid. Maria's jewelry box, already depleted by the years of exile, began to empty faster. There are stories from this era of Maria sitting in the lobby of a casino in Monte Carlo or San Remo, wearing her pearls, reading a book, patiently waiting for Pericles to finish losing her money. Why did she stay? Why did the proud, fierce Maria tolerate a husband who gambled away her security? Perhaps it was because Pericles gave her something money couldn't buy. He made her feel alive. He was her rebellion against the tragedy. He was her way of saying no to the role of the weeping widow. Or perhaps, after losing George so violently, she simply couldn't bear to be alone again. She would rather have a flawed husband than a ghost. Despite the gambling, the marriage endured. Pericles, for all his faults, was devoted to her in his own way. They traveled the world. They argued. They laughed. It was a messy, imperfect human relationship, a far cry from the stiff, formal perfection of the imperial court. Meanwhile, Maria never forgot George. This is the paradox of her heart. She could be married to Pericles and still mourn George. She kept George's photos on her desk. She told her grandchildren stories about the Grand Duke with the kind eyes. She wrote memoirs to ensure that history would not forget him. She lived in a duality, the wife of the admiral and the widow of the Grand Duke. As the 1930s progressed, Maria watched with a sinking heart as the dark clouds gathered over Europe once again. She had seen World War I destroy her first life. Now World War II was coming to threaten her second. Her daughters were grown. Nina had married a Georgian prince, Paul Chavchavadze, and moved to America. Zania had married William Leeds, the son of an American tin heiress, and lived a life of wealth on Long Island. They were safe. The line of George Mikhailovich had survived. Maria, however, was in Europe. She was tired of running. When the rumblings of war started in 1939, she was in her beloved Athens. She was 63 years old. Her health was failing. She watched as the Italians and then the Germans threatened Greece. She must have felt a terrible sense of déjà vu. Another war, another threat of invasion. But this time, she wasn't going to get on a train. She wasn't going to go to England. She was going to stay. The vacation that had started in 1914 was finally drawing to a close. The circle was about to be completed, not in the snows of Russia, but under the blue skies of the Mediterranean. But the return to Greece was not merely a retreat. It was an attempt to find a new center of gravity in a world that had spun off its axis. As Maria tried to build a life with her new husband amidst the shifting sands of European politics, she found that while she could escape the Russian winter, she could not escape the looming shadow of another war. The interwar years in Europe were a strange, feverish time, a period described by historians as a long weekend between two catastrophes. For Grand Duchess Maria Georgievna, now styling herself simply as Princess Maria, or sometimes using her second husband's surname, Ioannidis, these years were defined by a glamorous but exhausting rootlessness. She had survived the execution of her first husband and the collapse of the Romanov dynasty, but survival had left her adrift. She was a woman without a country, a royal without a throne, and a mother who had to watch her children become Americans, while she remained tethered to the ghosts of the old world. By the mid-1920s, the contrast between Maria's life and the lives of her daughters, Nina and Xenia, had become stark. While Maria was wandering the hotels of Europe with her gambling admiral husband, her daughters were securing their futures in the one place that still believed in the fairy tale of royalty, the United States. The salvation of the family's finances came from an unlikely source, tin. In 1921, Maria's younger daughter, Princess Xenia, married William Leeds Jr. He was not a prince. He was the son of an American tin plate magnate, heir to a staggering industrial fortune. The marriage was a sensation. The impoverished Romanov princess and the fabulously wealthy American heir. It was the dollar princess dynamic flipped on its head. For Maria, this union was a godsend. The Leeds fortune meant that her daughters would never know the hunger or the terror that had consumed their father. Xenia and William moved to a sprawling estate on Long Island, New York, called Kenwood, where they lived a life of Gatsby-esque luxury. They had yachts, planes, and racehorses. They took in Maria's elder daughter, Nina, who later married Prince Paul Chavchavadze and settled in Cape Cod. So by the late 1920s, the family was split by the Atlantic Ocean. The daughters were safe in America, becoming modern, jazz-age women who drove cars and drank cocktails. But Maria stayed behind. Why didn't she go to America? Why didn't she settle in the comfort of her daughter's Long Island estate? Part of it was pride. Maria was Greek Minnie. She was a Grand Duchess. The idea of living as a dependent in her son-in-law's house, of being the poor relation at the table, was intolerable to her. She preferred the precarious independence of Europe. But the bigger reason was likely Pericles. Her second husband, Admiral Pericles Ioannidis, did not fit into the drawing rooms of Long Island society. He was a creature of the Mediterranean, loud, volatile, and addicted to the adrenaline of the casino. In America, he would have been a curiosity, a gigolo figure. In Europe, amidst the fading aristocracy and the crumbling grand hotels, he made sense. Their life together in the 1930s was a nomadic existence. They moved between London, Rome, and Athens, following the seasons and the whims of the Greek political situation. Maria's brother, King Constantine I of Greece, had been deposed, reinstated, and deposed again. The Greek royal family was living out of suitcases, scattering across Europe like leaves in the wind. Maria became a fixture of this royal diaspora. She was the aunt that everyone visited, the one with the tragic past and the handsome, problematic husband. She wrote her memoirs during these years, trying to set the record straight about the Russia she had lost. In her writing, you sense a woman trying to justify her survival. She wrote obsessively about George, about his kindness, about his coin collection. It was as if she was trying to keep him alive through ink, even as she shared a bed with another man. But the financial strain was becoming acute. Pericles was not just a casual gambler, he was a committed one. There are stories whispered in royal circles of Maria having to quietly sell the last of her smaller jewels, a brooch here, a ring there, to cover his debts at the baccarat tables in San Remo. It is a poignant image. The Grand Duchess, who had once worn the crown jewels of the Romanovs, now sitting in a hotel room, calculating the exchange rate to see if they could afford to stay another week. Yet, she never left him. Perhaps she felt she had already lost one husband to history, and she refused to lose another to mathematics. She shielded Pericles, just as George had once shielded her. As the 1930s drew to a close, the long weekend of peace began to darken. The shadows that had swallowed Russia in 1917 were now stretching across the rest of the continent. Hitler was rising in Germany. Mussolini was posturing in Italy. The Spanish Civil War was raging. Maria, now in her 60s, felt the vibrations of the coming earthquake before most people. She had a sixth sense for disaster. She had lived through it before. She saw the same complacency in London and Paris that she had seen in St. Petersburg in 1914. They are sleepwalking, she wrote to her daughters in America. They do not see the fire. In 1938, she made a decision. She was tired of the hotels. She was tired of the gray skies of London. She wanted to go home. Home, for Maria, had never been Russia. It had never really been England. Home was Athens. She and Pericles returned to Greece. They moved into a house near the royal palace. It was a time of relative stability for Greece. The monarchy had been restored, and her nephew, King George II, was on the throne. For a brief, shining moment, Maria found peace. She was back in the city of her childhood. She could smell the oregano in the dust. She could see the Parthenon from her window. She was Aunt Minnie to the Greek royal family, a revered elder stateswoman who had survived the worst the world could throw at her. But history has a cruel sense of timing. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. World War II began. For Maria, the news must have been physically nauseating. 25 years earlier, almost to the day, a war had separated her from her husband and destroyed her life. Now it was happening again. This time, however, the threat came from Italy. Mussolini, jealous of Hitler's conquests, had his eyes on Greece. Throughout 1940, the tension mounted. The Italians sank a Greek cruiser. They made demands. Maria was now 64 years old. She was suffering from heart trouble and the accumulated stress of a lifetime of flight. Her daughters in America begged her to come to them. "Get on a ship," Zinnia urged. "Come to New York. It's safe here." But Maria refused. She was done running. She had run from Russia. She had run from the Bolsheviks. She had run from her memories. She would not run from the Italians. "I was born in Athens," she reportedly said. "If I must die, I will die here." On the morning of October 28, 1940, the Italian ambassador in Athens presented an ultimatum to the Greek dictator, Ioannis Metaxas. Allow Italian troops to occupy Greece or face war. Metaxas gave a one-word answer: oxy. Within hours, Italian troops crossed the border. Air raid sirens, a sound Maria had never heard in the First World War, began to wail over Athens. The city braced for the attack. Blackouts were enforced. Food was rationed. The younger members of the royal family prepared to evacuate or head to the front. But Grand Duchess Maria Georgievna stayed in her house. She sat in her drawing room as the sirens screamed, a frail elderly woman holding a cup of tea, surrounded by photographs of a dead Russian Grand Duke and a gambling Greek admiral. She had survived the fall of the Romanovs. She had survived the execution of her husband. She had survived the loss of her fortune. She had survived the scandal of her second marriage. But she knew, deep in her weary bones, that she would not survive this. Her heart, which had broken in 1914 and been patched together with scar tissue and stubbornness, was finally giving out. The circle that had begun on a train platform in St. Petersburg was closing. The exile was almost over. As the sirens wailed over the ancient city, marking the beginning of the end, Maria prepared for her final journey. It would not be a journey across borders or oceans, but a quiet passage into history where the pain of separation would finally be healed. Athens in the winter of 1940 was a city holding its breath. The air was thin and cold, vibrating with the sound of air raid sirens and the distant thud of anti-aircraft fire. The Greeks were fighting a miraculous war against the Italian invaders in the mountains of Epirus, holding the line with a ferocity that stunned the world. But inside the villa where Grand Duchess Maria Georgievna lay, the war felt far away. She was 64 years old, and her body, which had traveled thousands of miles to escape the trauma of her past, had finally run out of road. Her heart, the organ that had endured the shock of 1914, the long agony of 1919, and the erratic rhythm of her second marriage, was failing. In her final days, as she drifted in and out of consciousness, the timeline of her life likely collapsed. The noise of the sirens over Athens might have sounded like the steam whistles of the train at the Warsaw station in St. Petersburg. The cold draft in the hallway might have felt like the chill of the Neva River. Pericles Ioannidis, the admiral who had been her companion in the chaotic second act of her life, was by her side. But one suspects that in the quiet of her own mind, she was walking toward someone else. She was walking back toward the man she had left on the platform 26 years earlier. On December 14th, 1940, Grand Duchess Maria Georgievna died. She died just months before the German army would invade Greece and occupy Athens. History, in a rare act of mercy, spared her that final indignity. She did not have to see the swastika fly over the Acropolis. She died a free woman in her own country, surrounded by the family she loved. Her funeral was a solemn affair, held amidst the austerity of wartime. She was buried in the royal cemetery at Tatoi, the summer palace of the Greek royal family, located in the woods north of Athens. It is a beautiful, peaceful place, smelling of pine resin and dry earth. But as the earth covered her coffin, the stark tragedy of her geography became permanent. Grand Duke George Mikhailovich, the husband she had never stopped loving, lay in a mass grave inside the Peter and Paul Fortress in St. Petersburg, thousands of miles to the north, under the frozen ground of a city that no longer bore his name. Maria lay in the warm soil of Greece. They were separated by a continent, by a revolution, and by 21 years of silence. Yet in death, the separation ended. The longest goodbye was finally over. The vacation that had gone so terribly wrong had finally brought her home. The story of Maria Georgievna did not end with her death. Like ripples in a pond, the consequences of her survival spread outward, shaping the lives of her descendants in ways that were both triumphant and melancholic. Her two daughters, Princess Nina and Princess Xenia, the little girls who had been taken to England for a summer cure, never returned to Russia. They became the ultimate survivors of the Romanov catastrophe. Princess Xenia, the younger daughter, lived a life that seemed to be a direct rebuttal to the poverty of her exile. In 1921, she married William Leeds Jr., the heir to an immense American tin fortune. It was the stuff of tabloids, the penniless Romanov princess and the American multimillionaire. Xenia moved to New York and lived on a sprawling estate on Long Island called Kenwood. She had yachts, airplanes, and racehorses. She became a prominent figure in American society, a dollar princess who used her wealth to support the scattered remnants of the Russian nobility. Princess Nina, the elder daughter, took a different path. She married Prince Paul Chavchavadze, a Georgian prince who was also a refugee. They settled in Wellfleet, Massachusetts on Cape Cod. Nina lived a quiet, artistic life. She became a painter. She raised a family. She refused the glitz of high society, preferring the sound of the ocean and the company of artists. But both sisters shared one defining trait. They never forgot their father. Nina and Xenia spent their lives correcting the historical record. They provided the information for biographies. They kept the memory of Grand Duke George alive. They told their American children about the gentle man with the limp who loved coins, the man who had stayed behind so they could live. In a profound sense, George's sacrifice was validated by their survival. If he had insisted they stay in Russia in 1914, or if he had demanded they return in 1915, they would almost certainly have perished in the cellar of a Bolshevik prison. By letting them go, by enduring the loneliness of his imprisonment without demanding their return, he gave them the gift of a future. So what is the legacy of the Grand Duchess who got trapped in England? Maria Georgievna is often overlooked in the pantheon of Romanov martyrs. She wasn't shot. She wasn't bayoneted. She wasn't thrown down a mine shaft. Her tragedy was less cinematic, but perhaps more relatable. Her tragedy was the tragedy of the survivor. She represents the millions of people in the 20th century who were displaced by war, who went out for a pack of cigarettes or a summer holiday and found that the border had closed behind them forever. She represents the guilt of the one who got away. She spent 26 years trying to justify her own existence. She sold her jewels to educate her daughters. She married a gambler to feel alive. She wrote memoirs to fight the silence. She refused to simply be a victim. When we look at the grainy black and white photos of the Romanov family today, we usually look for the faces of the Tsar and his children. But look for the woman in the background, the one with the fierce Greek eyes and the slightly defiant posture. She is the reminder that history is not just about the people who die, it is about the people who are left to pick up the pieces. It is about the women who wait for letters that never come. It is about the mothers who have to tell their children that Papa isn't coming to England for Christmas. The train that pulled out of the Warsaw Station in July 1914 carried Maria Georgievna away from her husband, her home, and her identity. It took her on a detour through hell, through poverty, and through the slow erosion of exile. But in the end, it delivered her to a place of peace. The Romanov dynasty is dust. The Winter Palace is a museum. The coins George collected are scattered in glass cases around the world. But the bloodline survived. It lives on in America, in the descendants of Nina and Xenia, who walk the streets of New York and Massachusetts free and alive because a limping man on a platform once waved goodbye and let the train leave the station. The princess was trapped, yes, but because she was trapped, the family lived. And that, in the brutal calculus of history, is the only victory that matters.